October 5, 2023. Raleigh, North Carolina. At 6:30 a.m., Patricia Hughes took her golden retriever Bailey for their usual morning walk through the Pinecrest Apartments parking lot. The air was crisp, the complex still quiet as most residents slept. But as she passed a row of cars, something unusual caught her eye. A man lay motionless near a parked sedan. At first she thought he had passed out, maybe a drunk tenant who hadn't made it inside. But as she stepped closer, the details sharpened. His body was twisted awkwardly, arms limp. His hoodie was dark, but not dark enough to hide the deep red stain spreading beneath him. Her stomach clenched. The metallic scent of blood drifted in the air. Bailey whined, shifting nervously beside her. Patricia's hands trembled as she fumbled for her phone, barely able to press 911. Her voice came out shaky, breathless. "There's a man on the ground. He's not moving. Oh God, there's blood. A lot of it." Within minutes, the quiet morning was shattered by flashing lights and sirens. Officers Michael Tanner, 40, and Sarah Whitman, 32, arrived first, stepping out of their patrol car with wary eyes. Tanner crouched beside the body. Young male, mid-20s. One gunshot to the chest, another to the head. Clean, precise. This wasn't a random attack. Whitman checked his pockets. His wallet was still there, cash and cards untouched. A watch still on his wrist, his phone, inches from his outstretched hand. "This wasn't a robbery," she muttered. Minutes later, detectives Aaron Mitchell, 44, and Olivia Parker, 37, pulled up, their expressions unreadable as they assessed the scene. "Who found him?" Mitchell asked. "Patricia Hughes, walking her dog," Tanner replied. "Didn't see anything, just found the body." Parker studied the victim. Jason Reynolds, 26. A software engineer, no obvious reason to be lying dead in a parking lot before sunrise. She exhaled. Someone wanted him dead. Mitchell's gaze swept the empty lot. No security cameras, no shell casings, no signs of a struggle. "Let's find out who." Detectives Aaron Mitchell and Olivia Parker stood in the quiet apartment of Jason Reynolds, taking in the life he had left behind. His neatly arranged desk, the half-full coffee cup on the counter, the bed that had been slept in just hours before his murder. It all painted the picture of a man who had no idea he was living his last night. Jason Reynolds wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be executed in a parking lot. At 26, he was a rising software engineer at Crestview Tech, known for his work ethic and quiet personality. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. By all accounts, he was a good guy. His parents were devastated. His co-workers were shocked. His best friend, Mark Lively, could barely speak when questioned by detectives. Jason didn't have enemies, Mark insisted. He wasn't the kind of guy to get into fights or owe people money. He worked, came home, spent time with Emily. That was his life. Jason had been dating Emily Carter, a 25-year-old nursing assistant, for about 4 months. Their relationship was new, but close friends said he was serious about her. The two had been making plans, weekend trips, future vacations. Jason had even talked about introducing her to his family over the holidays. Mitchell frowned. "And you're sure there was no one in his life who might have had a problem with him?" Mark hesitated, thinking. "Not Jason," he finally said. "But maybe Emily." The timeline leading up to Jason's murder was frustratingly simple. At 10:30 p.m., he left work after finishing a late project. Security footage showed him walking to his car alone. At 10:50 p.m., he stopped at a gas station, grabbed a bottle of water, and paid in cash. Surveillance cameras captured him at the register, scrolling through his phone as he waited for his change. There was no sign he was being followed. At 11:05 p.m., Jason pulled into the parking lot of Pinecrest Apartments. By 11:10 p.m., he was dead. There were no witnesses. No one reported hearing gunshots, and the apartment complex didn't have security cameras covering that part of the lot. Detective Parker studied the case file, shaking her head. It's like he vanished into the dark. But Jason hadn't just been killed. He had been executed. A gunshot to the chest, a second to the head. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. The question was by who? Detective Olivia Parker knew the look well, eyes swollen from crying, skin blotchy, hands trembling. Emily Carter stood in the doorway of her apartment, her fingers twisting the fabric of her hoodie, her breath uneven. The news had shattered her. "Jason. No, this can't be real," she whispered, stepping back into the dimly lit space. "We were supposed to have dinner tonight." Her apartment was small, clean except for a blanket tossed carelessly onto the couch. The kitchen light flickered, casting a dull glow over the room. Parker took in the details, looking beyond the grief, because sometimes grief hid things. Emily collapsed onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. "He was perfect," she said, her voice barely audible. "He was kind. He made me feel safe." Mitchell leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Emily, did Jason have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" She hesitated. A split second, a flicker of something in her eyes. "Not Jason," she finally said, her voice quieter now. "But maybe me." Parker's gaze sharpened. "What do you mean?" Emily swallowed hard. Her hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. "My ex," she said. "Ryan Dalton, he never let go." Ryan Dalton. The name settled uneasily in Parker's mind. They ran him through the system the moment they got back to the station. 27 years old, worked as a mechanic, no major criminal record. But one detail stood out. Emily had filed a restraining order against him in 2021. Reason: repeated harassment, obsessive behavior. Mitchell tapped his pen against the case file. Restraining order expired last year, he noted. Nothing stopping him now. And Ryan, he was still around. They combed through Emily's phone records next. The texts were subtle at first. Messages from an unknown number. "You moved on fast. He's not right for you. You'll regret this." Then the tone shifted. "You think he'll protect you?" "He won't. You don't get to just forget me." Emily had never responded. The last message had been sent 2 weeks before Jason's murder. Parker leaned back in her chair. He wasn't done with her. Mitchell exhaled sharply. "The question is, was he desperate enough to kill?" A quiet sense of unease settled over the case. They had no proof Ryan was anywhere near Pinecrest Apartments that night. No direct threats, no physical evidence. But the feeling was there. The detectives interviewed Emily's closest friends. Every story was the same. Ryan had never taken their breakup well. There had been late-night phone calls, flowers left on her doorstep, moments where Emily swore she saw his car idling near her work. One friend, Leah Carter, hesitated before speaking. "I saw him a few weeks ago," she admitted. "Outside Emily's apartment, just watching." "Did Emily know?" Parker asked. Leah shook her head. "I didn't want to scare her, and I thought maybe I was overreacting." Mitchell exchanged a look with Parker. Maybe Leah had ignored it, but Ryan Dalton hadn't stopped watching. The next morning, Detectives Parker and Mitchell pulled up to a small, run-down house on the edge of town. Ryan Dalton's place, paint peeling on the siding, overgrown grass in the yard. A house that looked like it had been left to fall apart, much like the man who lived inside it. Parker knocked, a long pause, then slow footsteps. The door swung open. Ryan stood there, barefoot, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans. He looked like he had just rolled out of bed, but something about him felt off. He wasn't groggy. He wasn't confused. He was too calm. And then, before they could even say a word, he smirked. "I already know why you're here." Detective Parker narrowed her eyes. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't look surprised. Just amused. Mitchell didn't let it slide. "That's so. Then you know we have questions." Ryan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I'm sure you do." Mitchell got straight to it. "Where were you on the night of the 4th of October?" Ryan didn't even blink. "Home, watching the game." "Which game?" "Panthers versus Bears." Mitchell tilted his head. "Final score?" "A beat, just long enough to notice." Ryan shrugged. "Didn't finish it, fell asleep." Parker glanced at Mitchell. A tiny inconsistency, but an inconsistency all the same. Mitchell pressed on. "Anyone who can confirm that?" Ryan smirked again, but this time it wasn't as strong. "Nope, I live alone." No alibi. Parker let the silence stretch, watching him. His fingers drummed lightly against his arm. A restless habit. Maybe nerves. Maybe something else. Mitchell flipped through his notes, then casually he asked, "You and Emily dated for 3 years, right?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "We were together, yeah." "Breakups are tough," Parker said, keeping her tone light, "especially when one person moves on before the other is ready." A flicker of something in Ryan's eyes. Gone in a second. "I moved on," he said flatly. Parker wasn't buying it. She nodded toward his phone on a small table by the door. "Mind if we take a look at your messages?" The smirk returned, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I do mind." Mitchell closed his notepad. "Then we'll be back with a warrant." Ryan didn't stop them as they walked away. But as Parker got into the car, she glanced back. Ryan was still standing in the doorway watching them. The smirk was gone. Everything about him screamed guilt. He had motive. He had no alibi. But they had no proof. And then, just when they thought they had their guy, the case took a turn no one expected. Detectives Parker and Mitchell had spent the past 48 hours convinced that Ryan Dalton was their guy. His lack of an alibi, his history with Emily, the thinly veiled hostility in his voice, it all fit too perfectly. But then, a new piece of evidence changed everything. The discovery came from an unexpected place, a small grocery store just a block from Pinecrest Apartments. Detective Mitchell had been reviewing nearby surveillance footage, searching for anything that might confirm Ryan Dalton's presence near the scene. Most of it had been useless, poor angles, grainy images, nothing substantial. But then something caught his eye. A car, a black sedan, parked just down the street from the apartment complex. It wasn't there at 10:45 p.m., it wasn't there at 10:55 p.m., but at exactly 11:03 p.m., just 2 minutes before Jason Reynolds was killed, it pulled up and stopped. It didn't move again for another 20 minutes, and then at 11:23 p.m., after Jason was already dead, it drove off. Parker leaned in closer, studying the footage. "Can we get a plate?" Mitchell nodded, already typing into the database. Seconds later, a match. Daniel Myers, 30 years old, Jason's coworker. The pieces didn't fit, not yet, but something about it felt wrong. Ryan Dalton had every reason to hate Jason. He was an obsessive ex, a man with a grudge. But Daniel? Why would he be there? Daniel had worked with Jason at Crestview Tech for 3 years. Quiet, kept to himself, no known history of violence. On paper, he was nothing more than a colleague. But the more detectives dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Coworkers described Jason as friendly, easygoing, but when asked about Daniel, a hesitation. He's intense. Smart guy, but weird around Jason. There was tension between them, I don't know why. It wasn't much, just a vague unease, a feeling that something had been off. But it was enough to make detectives look closer. And then they found something. A hidden rivalry. Buried in Crestview Tech's internal emails, there was a trail, subtle, but there. Daniel and Jason had been working on the same project. A big one, a project that, if successful, could mean promotions, recognition. And Jason? He had been outperforming Daniel. In the weeks leading up to his death, Jason had been given more responsibility, more praise, a quiet shift in power that might not have meant much, except to someone who had everything riding on it. The tension at work, the car near the crime scene. It wasn't enough to call him a killer, but it was enough to make him their second suspect. Now detectives had a problem. For days they had believed Ryan Dalton was their guy. His obsession with Emily, his threatening texts, every clue pointed to him. But the case was no longer so simple. Because Jason Reynolds hadn't just had a jealous ex, he'd had a competitor. And if Daniel Myers had been near the scene that night, then maybe Ryan Dalton wasn't the only one who had a reason to want Jason Reynolds dead. For days, detectives had been circling 2 names, Ryan Dalton and Daniel Myers. One, the jealous ex-boyfriend, a man who had been unable to let go. The other, a coworker with a hidden grudge, a man who had been quietly competing with Jason in ways no one had realized. 2 suspects, 2 motives, but only one killer. The problem, both of them were slipping through their fingers. Interrogating Daniel Myers. Detectives Parker and Mitchell brought Daniel Myers in for questioning early the next morning. They expected nervousness, hesitation, some sign that he had something to hide. Instead, they got the opposite. Daniel was calm, collected, even cooperative. He sat across from them, hands folded neatly on the table. If he was rattled by the fact that police had linked his car to the crime scene, he didn't show it. Mitchell wasted no time. "We have you on camera near Pinecrest Apartments the night Jason Reynolds was murdered. Want to explain why you were there?" Daniel nodded like he'd been waiting for the question. "I was in the area, yeah. I just picked up takeout from a restaurant a few blocks over." "Which restaurant?" He answered immediately. "Golden Walk. I have the receipt if you need it." Parker studied him carefully. "So you just happened to be parked near the complex, right around the time Jason was killed?" A slight shrug. "I ate in my car, long day at work, didn't feel like going home yet." It was a solid answer, too solid. Parker and Mitchell tried to push. Why hadn't he mentioned this earlier? Did he know Jason had been killed just a few feet away? But Daniel never wavered. "I barely knew Jason outside of work," he said simply. "We weren't friends, we weren't enemies. I had no reason to hurt him." He was unshakable, and as frustrating as it was, they had nothing. A car near the crime scene wasn't enough to make an arrest. They needed something concrete, something undeniable. And that's when everything changed. A break in the case. It happened later that night. A rookie officer assigned to comb through surveillance footage noticed something detectives had missed. A dumpster, just a block from Ryan Dalton's house. At 3:17 a.m., hours after Jason Reynolds had been murdered, A figure approached it. The footage was too grainy to make out details, but one thing was clear: the man had tossed something inside before walking away. Uniformed officers were sent to investigate. What they found would break the case wide open. Buried beneath trash bags and discarded papers, they pulled out a single bullet casing. Forensics ran tests. It was a match. The bullet that killed Jason Reynolds had come from that casing, and it had been sitting in a dumpster just minutes from Ryan Dalton's house. There was no question now. This wasn't about workplace rivalries. It was never about Daniel Myers. This was about Ryan Dalton. Detectives returned to Ryan Dalton's house just before dawn. This time, when he opened the door, there was no smirk, no smug confidence, just silence. Ryan was brought to the station, placed in the interrogation room. At first, he stuck to his story. He'd been home, watching the game, had nothing to do with Jason's death. But when Mitchell slid the evidence across the table, the casing, the ballistic report, the footage of a man discarding something in a dumpster near his house, Ryan's demeanor changed. His hands clenched into fists. His breathing grew uneven. And then, after 4 hours of silence, denials, and long stretches of staring at the wall, he broke. His voice was quiet at first. "I just wanted to scare him." Parker and Mitchell stayed silent. Let him keep talking. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted Emily to see that he wasn't right for her, that she was making a mistake." His breaths were shallow now. "But he wouldn't back down," Ryan whispered. "I told him to stay away, to end it. He wouldn't listen." His fingers curled around the edge of the table. His voice cracked. "I didn't mean to kill him." But it was too late. Ryan Dalton had gone from a scorned ex to a murderer, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for it. The trial was swift. Ryan Dalton, once just another man nursing a broken heart, was now the face of obsession turned deadly. Prosecutors painted a clear picture. A man who had lost control, whose bitterness had festered into something dark and violent. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, and the verdict: guilty, first-degree murder. Ryan sat motionless as the sentence was read. Life in prison, no chance of parole, no second chances, no way out. The smirk, the arrogance from his first police interview was gone, but there was no remorse either, only silence. As he was led from the courtroom in cuffs, he didn't look at Jason's family, didn't glance at Emily. He just stared ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge the life he had destroyed. But for everyone else, the damage had already been done. Emily had spent months blaming herself. If she hadn't dated Ryan, if she had seen the warning signs earlier, if she had done something differently, maybe Jason would still be alive. But the truth was, Jason had never even been part of this story. Not really. He had just fallen in love with the wrong person at the wrong time, and Ryan had made sure he would pay the price for it. In the months after the trial, Emily packed up her life and left Raleigh for good. Too many ghosts haunted her here. She tried to move on. She told herself that one day maybe she would be able to love again without looking over her shoulder. But the nightmares followed her. The thought that she had brought Jason into a storm he never saw coming. And the worst part? She never saw it coming either. Jason Reynolds had been a son, a friend, a man with his entire future ahead of him. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't the kind of person who made enemies. But none of that had mattered. Because when Ryan Dalton looked at him, he didn't see a person, he saw an obstacle. And when jealousy turns into rage, when love twists into possession, obstacles aren't meant to be walked around. They're meant to be eliminated. Jason never stood a chance. His family buried him on a crisp October morning, the same month he had been taken from them. They spoke about his kindness, his ambition, his plans for the future, dreams that would never be realized. But no matter how many kind words were spoken, they all ended the same way, with the aching, unanswerable question, why? Some crimes are random, some are calculated, and then there are the ones that never should have happened at all. Jason Reynolds didn't break any laws, didn't start any fights, didn't wrong anyone. He simply loved the wrong woman, and for that he was killed. For Emily, for Jason's family, for everyone who had known him, justice was served. But justice wasn't enough. Because in the end, the truth remained the same. Jason Reynolds was gone, and no guilty verdict could ever bring him back.